Hello, everybody. My name is Kuvin Makiyamasi. I'm giving you a historical talk on this is the second part of my series on what was the USSR. The title I derived from an article I read on Aufheben magazine, which is available online. Which is also entitled "What Was the USSR?" And it's from this that I derive some of my theory, which informs this event. So this event is part two. Part two deals with society, with politics, and with the economy. The last episode, episode one, we left at the Kronstadt Rising, which occurred in Petrograd in March 1921. This event marks the decisive end of the revolutionary period. Namely, this is the end of all major challenges, whether from the right in the form of white armies or interventionist forces, or the left, meaning risings like the Kronstadt Rising. So the emergence of the USSR as a new state in a world still dominated by a capitalist hegemony is achieved under the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or CPSU. This event, the March 1921, also marks a shift by the CPSU. This is away from the extremes of war communism. The extremes of war communism included grain requisitions. It included a police state type approach to civil liberties. And it also meant repression of workers, Soviets. That's Soviets with a small s, meaning workers' councils, under the title of the Supreme Soviet with capital S, and this was dominated by the CPSU. But the move away from war communism was not, and this is very important, it was not to restore the democratic power of the workers, peasants, and soldiers, Soviets or workers' councils, as the rebellion had demanded, but instead it was to move in a completely different direction. It was instead the Lenin's New Economic Policy, or NEP, from 1922 onwards, and it encouraged the restoration of a market economy in a binary arrangement with the state. Now, this is very close to Keynesianism. In fact, the state retained control of the heavy industry, but pretty much everything else is devolved in the economic sense. It's devolved to small and medium-sized businesses. Lenin, he justified this move as one he regretted, so he said, but it was one which he thought was necessary under the dire circumstances in a country, as he put it, not yet ready for socialism. Well, that's not what the peasants and the workers thought, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have rebelled in Kronstadt. But that's how he thought of it, because he was following, and if you remember, we discussed this in the first episode, he's following what is known as the stages theory, which is that you can't get to socialism without going through capitalism first. The stages theory is a crudification of Marx, and it it starts with the idea that you have feudal society, and then you have capitalist society, and then you have socialist society, and finally you end up in communism. So it's a deterministic approach to history, which Karl Marx was definitely not in favor of. So having ruthlessly crushed the party's base, he now held out the olive branch to small and medium property owners. The gamble paid off, for the country was indeed exhausted after civil war and several revolutions. So the NEP did appear at the time to offer a return to some sort of normality. Next picture. Right, so the NEP was Lenin's last important act as party leader. Shortly afterwards, he had a succession of 3 strokes and he was left mute. The party was now in the hands of the all-important Politburo and Central Committee, including Trotsky, Bukharin, Voroshilov, Kamenev, and a few others. Of course, Lenin had his hand in increasing the powers of the Politburo and the Central Committee himself. And so he's partly to blame for this concentration of power in the Central Committee and Politburo. But having not only crushed the workers' attempts to reclaim democratic control over the means of production, he also stifled any meaningful internal democracy. He'd already done that in 1921. And in the CPSU itself, he also had this obsessive centralization policy, and even in the Third International, that's the Comintern as it was dubbed, where you had to sign 21 boxes. You had to tick 21 boxes in order to be accepted as a communist party according to the demands of the Comintern. And needless to say, a lot of them left. An important section left. They were known as the Council Communists later on, or as Lenin dubbed them in one of his last documents, one of his last pamphlets. He called them left-wing communism and infantile disorder, because by this time he was looking to align the communist parties of Europe alongside the social democratic parties. The Social Democratic Party of Germany in particular, that was not a very good move, because the Social Democratic Party of Germany had been crushing the communists and would continue to do so for a couple of more years. So he had created an oligarchy of revolutionary experts, or experts in scare quotes, where all power was held by state forces and a tiny party elite. It seems during his final illness, Lenin gained insight into some of the errors he committed along the way. We know he tried and failed to communicate a disquiet with the increasing control of Stalin over the party bureaucracy, for example, but it was all far too late. We also know that when he was on his deathbed and his wife was next to him, he actually turned around to her and he said, "I wonder if everything I done was wrong." Worn out and quarantined from political life, Lenin died in early 1924. He had a specific request that he was to have a very ordinary, quiet funeral. Now that wish, of course, as we know today, was denied. He was instead installed in a great ceremony in a mausoleum where he still remains today. Next picture. Right, this is a map of the Soviet Union. You can see the vast size of the country as it was in the 1920s. There isn't a huge amount of difference to the former Russian Empire in its scope, but what you can see is that Finland has managed to break free of Russian control, as have the Baltic states, and in particular Poland. So these are the important changes that have happened, but otherwise the frontiers and the vast frontiers that they have to defend are much the same. The vast majority of the population is concentrated in the west of the country. The east of the country, with a couple of pockets, apart from a couple of pockets, is almost uninhabited. There is also the west is also where the cities are, but the country remains overwhelmingly agrarian, very backward in many respects, with all the limited modernization there is in the West, and there are still tribal groups, for instance, in the south of the country, and clans of hunter-gatherers in the Far East. Who have very little contact with the center at all. The original idea of Lenin was to have a confederation. He thought of the Soviet Union not as being a centralized state. As I say, there's some contradictions here because he was obviously very much a centralist himself, but he professed to have this idea that each Soviet republic would be more or less independent and would look after its own affairs, would have its own languages, and would have its own cultural events and things like this. This didn't quite work out in practice because the Supreme Soviet in Moscow tended to dominate everything else. But there was a little bit of independence as far as the provincial Soviets were concerned in terms of culture and language. Next picture. Right, the status of women in the early USSR, and this is certainly in the cities, goes through a big transformation. There's a deliberate policy to increase the number of women in the workplace and to protect women's rights over their own bodies. This is quite a big move, especially when you consider what the status of women in the Tsarist period was like. They had achieved quite a share of political and legal emancipation. Campaigns were also being launched to try and bridge the gap between city and peasant women too, albeit they used these agitprop posters, which often displayed, unfortunately, a rather patronizing view of peasant women as downtrodden drudges, which the bob haircutted modern city woman was going to release from bondage, from feudal bondage. So in many respects, for those women who were raised in the city and were professionally trained or connected to the party in some way, then the 1920s were certainly a big step forward in a way that mirrored similar developments in North America and Western Europe, and even in many ways probably excelled the latter. A general progressive attitude to sexual liberation of all kinds also prevailed in the cities. Homosexuality was decriminalized, and the picture you see on the left shows a Moscow drag show in the 1920s. Next slide. But in many ways, however, there are disturbingly close parallels from early on in the USSR, with the same contrasts and contradictions that one normally associates with the capitalist mode of production, such as unemployment. There was quite a bit of unemployment in the 1920s, and there was street children. You can see the street children on the right there. And below, we can see a Yalta resort shoe shine boy. Yes, he may not now be shining the shoes of a Tsarist army officer, but he's shining the shoes of a commissar. So what's the difference? The CPSU response at the time to such criticism, of course, would have been to blame such sites on the necessary concessions unwillingly given to the bourgeoisie in the course of the NEP, the new economic policy. But who are the bourgeoisie? The bourgeoisie, in strict Marxian terms, do not exist because they're only small to middle size industries in the cities. You know, you're talking about maybe 1% of the population. So where are the bourgeoisie? Ideology is always ready to mystify reality. Next slide. Inside the CPSU, the Central Committee and the Politburo are discussing the leading question of the 1920s as far as they were concerned. This was how the best to achieve communism from out of state capitalism. Now, state capitalism was Lenin's sober and frank assessment of all that had been achieved in the period 1921 to 22. That's the early new economic policy. Lenin proposed that the NEP should remain in place for at least 20 years until the USSR was far enough developed, in his view, to achieve socialism. The Communist Party was now in complete control over the USSR's territory, but as the world revolution had failed and power on the global stage was still being held by capitalist states. So you had a problem there, and the new Soviet Union was still an overwhelmingly agrarian economy, as we've already discussed, heavily dependent on Western technology and skills for its small but very important industrial sector. The official party debate was centered around those on the left, in scare quotes, such as Trotsky, who was for promoting world revolution and a very rapid industrialization program. And those on the right, such as Bukharin, who advocated sticking to the NEP and reaching some sort of accommodation with capitalist powers so that they could get the technology and the industrial help that they needed. In the background of all this was Stalin. You can see him, a young Stalin in the center there, and he was busy consolidating his power. He wasn't really committing himself one way or another, but he posed as a rightist earlier on so that he could purge the left once he was head of the party, before reversing course so that he could purge the right. Next slide. Right, so now power was being concentrated all in the hands of a single individual. That was apparent by 1929. Trotsky being forced out of the country. Many of the other ones were either disgraced, and they were either associated with the left or with the right. And Stalin was able to appear as though he was going to be a central figure that would combine the two into one. But as soon as he takes power, he starts on a series of purges. He starts to purge the old Bolsheviks, and he uses this ties of patronage that he had extending deep into the party apparatus with a whole lot of young people who had risen up through the organization through him, and he uses them to get rid of the old Bolsheviks as they became known, because they were becoming redundant to Stalin's interests, and soon almost anyone who was tied to the past in some sort of a way was to be eliminated. This was quite thorough. He pretty much eliminated everybody. Very few people from the original Bolshevik period survived through to the end of the 1940s anyway. And he was probably in a sense Stalin was able now. He was now able to embrace Trotsky and Preobrazhensky. Now Preobrazhensky is Trotsky's economist. They had advocated a rapid industrial plans for both the town and the country. And then he decides to turn them all around, and he calls it his own. And then he implements it under the name that he's given it of socialism in one country. So the idea being that the USSR is now going to cut itself off from the rest of the world, and it's going to develop socialism alone. So we have the start of collectivization. The picture on the left shows three types of peasantry that the state had identified in the 1920s. You can see the poor peasant household at the top, that of the middle peasant is in between, and the rich peasant or kulak household is at the bottom. In fact, only 1% of Soviet peasantry lived entirely off the labor of others. This is the technical Marxian definition of a capitalist. But that didn't stop the Communist Party from identifying anybody who was to be described as a kulak, and that could just mean that you had 3 cows instead of 2 cows as a capitalist. In fact, of course, the peasantry could not be categorized in these very crude manners, because the actual relationships which existed in the countryside were extremely different to anything the Communist Party was imagining, because it had this very simplistic view of, oh, there must be some capitalists there, and therefore we have to get all the poor peasants, like you can see at the top, to resist the rich peasants. And of course, it wasn't anything like as simple as that. It needs to be stressed that these categories were great simplifications stretched to fit the ideology of the CPSU, who were, we have to point this out, they were overwhelmingly townsfolk of the intelligentsia, with a sense of patronizing superiority over and with ignorance of the peasantry. They'd already destroyed the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which was actually allied to them, and which drew its main support from the peasantry. So that if they'd left the SRs be and they hadn't wiped them out, then the left SRs would have been able to give them a manageable and a humane collectivization policy, but instead they insisted on going ahead with a program originating in the city office up in Moscow. Next picture. Right, propaganda films like the one pictured, The First Tractor, they give no idea as to the traumatic reality of the state-forced collectivization process. There were resettlements on an enormous scale, often with little provision for survival when the newcomers arrived. Masses of peasants were arbitrarily branded as kulaks without any connection to their wealth. It was just you objected to the collectivization process, so you'd be branded as a kulak, no matter if you didn't have any cows at all, let alone if you had half a dozen or so. And this was often to just fulfill quotas as well, handed down from Moscow. So they would say, we need you to brand 10% of the people in this region in A with as kulaks, and to eliminate them. So this was what was handed down and carried out by the people on the ground. They had to fulfill their quotas. So the word became meaningless and a term of abuse. So there was massive movements of population often from one end of the country to another. And when the peasants arrived at the location, they found that the ground was unprepared, and that there was no means of easy access to a town or a city, because all their land had been taken away and had been collectivized in the name of the state. So that meant that even their little gardens where they could have produced some vegetables had been taken away, and then they were supposed to be able to buy commodities in the form of food and things like this at the local shop. Well, if you've been stuck in a collective farm in the middle of nowhere, you might find the nearest collective shop might be scores of miles away. So it wasn't very practical and created huge hardship, and in fact it created famine. Instead, the grain was be bought in quotas by the state at artificially lowered prices. So, and once again, quotas were required, and the grain was to be sold by and large on the open market. This was where the capital would be raised for the industrialization process. Faced with what they perceived as just an updated form of grain requisition, as already experienced under war communism, the peasants decided to fight back. So risings occurred in many regions, and these were mostly repressed with great savagery. Other peasants resorted to sabotage, sabotage on a massive scale that had quite catastrophic consequences of its own. For example, stock farmers in revenge killing off their cattle so they couldn't be collectivized. The irony of all this is that it was almost identical to the accumulation process under capitalism, the primitive accumulation of capital, as described by Marx, except that it was just carried out at high speed. Now, if you want an example of what the primitive accumulation of capital is, the idea is that it's how the capitalist makes the money to be able to expand into industry. The capitalist accumulation, the primitive accumulation process, it takes place mainly in the countryside. So it's the expropriation of the peasantry to force them into being wage laborers, and then also through the form of slavery. So this is very similar to what is going to happen in the Soviet Union during this period of Stalin's, where the state has taken full control now. There's no private business. Everything's going to be collectivized, and industrialization is going to take place on a massive scale. So the only difference between the two is that one happens in the process, the Stalinist one happens in the process of about 10 to 20 years, whereas in the say what happened in England in the 17th century takes place over about 100 years. So and another big difference is that the agency of capital accumulation, instead of being individual capitalists or cliques of capitalists, becomes the state apparatus, the central command economy of the state. Next picture. One of the consequences of collectivization, whether created through callousness or sheer incompetence, was the Great Famine of 1932 to 33, when millions died of starvation. The map on the right shows the distribution and concentration of the famine's worst effects, spreading from Ukraine all the way to Kazakhstan. Now, political motivation or genocide has been raised in particular in the case of Ukraine. And there is some evidence for it, but not enough, in my view, to justify calling it a ethnic genocide. Perhaps it had genocidal proportions, but I don't think it was a ethnic one, because the Ukraine is if you look at the map, you'll see where the famine hit the hardest. So it is predominantly in the east of the Ukraine. Now, the nationalist part of the Ukraine is predominantly in the west, which, as you can see, is not particularly well, badly affected. Affected for sure, but not badly affected. Whereas the region which is particularly affected in the east Ukraine also happens to be where in the civil war the anarchists were very strong, and it also had a mixture of Russian, Jewish, and Ukrainian peasantry, a lot of them very poor peasants. And so one can interpret this as being a political extermination campaign rather than a ethnic one, because they wanted to take revenge on the anarchists for daring to pursue a different course to the form of the revolution that was preferred by the Bolsheviks. But in fact, the famine, as you can see on the map, the famine also spreads far beyond the Ukraine, and you've got a big concentration in the southern Caucasus there, and you've also got a big concentration in the Don Basin, and as far as Kazakhstan. So it doesn't, to my mind, it doesn't seem to be. I think that there's a good argument to say that the Ukraine is not unique in suffering in the way it did under Stalin. Next picture. So industrialization to put the USSR on an equal footing with its capitalist neighbors was the aim behind the capital accumulation that came out of collectivization. Whatever had been extracted from the grain, sold on the open market with the West, that could be plowed straight back into industrial construction. These plants being constructed on a gigantic scale, and often with little thought or care put into either the plant's practicality or the conditions its workers would have to live under. The actual success of this process has been long studied, both in the West and in the East since the documentation became available, but it's still very difficult to discern what the level of success was. Part of the problem arises out of the falsifications of quotas and other state manipulations of the evidence. But in certain areas, such as iron or steel making and coal mining, I think the advances are indisputable. Again, if population concentration in cities, and these are cities now with full employment, because this was one of Stalin's main objectives, was to get full employment everywhere, and this is seen as a metric of development. Then the USSR's urban population increases from around about 10% in the 1920s to over 50% by the 1950s. It's also worth pointing out that amidst all this horror, there was there were great strides forward being made in education. There were now schools everywhere, and the children were being taught to read and write, which in the countryside had been pretty much lacking beforehand. And and also in terms of medical care, so there's hospitals being established over the country as well. However, there is a lot to be that hasn't caught up, in particular the road and rail infrastructure and various other aspects. However, on the question of whether these grand schemes actually helped the USSR catch up with the West, or even to win the Great Patriotic War, is a debatable matter. Next slide. Remarkably, however, protest carries on against CPSU policy in the USSR. We have evidence of it by both workers and peasants. The picture on the left there is of a 1928 protest against a resettlement. This is where the peasants have been moved from one place to another, and they're not happy with it. The trick here, as you can see in the picture on the left, the trick is to make your protest non-political. This means to wield icons of the regime, such as portraits of its current leaders, so that you can avoid being labeled as an enemy of the state, which would be a fatal mistake if you did manage to do that. So you know, people learn different techniques of fighting back. You couldn't make it political, but you could get around it other ways. For instance, the peasants also used religion in a very similar way. If they protested about in form of a political protest, then they wouldn't get anywhere and would probably be repressed very quickly. But if they said it was to do with God or the Virgin Mary or something like this, then they were more likely to get away with it. As well as the normal working class weapons of slacking and economic sabotage. Now, this is in the class war that exists between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. If you're not able to strike, then or to occupy a factory or something like this, then if that avenue is not open to you, then the ways of fighting back are individualist and passive. So that would include slacking and economic sabotage. And we know that this became an endemic problem in the USSR, especially as the years wore on. Certainly by the 1970s, it was really endemic, but it was actually endemic long before that, which also asks the question, well, you know, if the bourgeoisie doesn't exist, if the workers are actually in control of the state, who are the workers engaged in class war against? Because if the bourgeoisie does not exist, then they shouldn't need to engage in class conflict, but obviously they did. It also has to be said that there are many strikes in the 1930s, which we've now discovered evidence of, and some of them were successful. This is not what you might expect in Stalinist times. You expect them to just be mown down or something like this, but actually they found it very difficult to move against the industrial working class for obvious reasons, for ideological ones. So that was actually, some of these strikes were successful. Next picture, please. Right, so if you had been arrested and your crime was deemed as political, then you usually faced one of three fates. The first was that you were to be shot, maybe after torture to gain a, scare quotes, confession, or you would be sentenced to hard labor in the Gulag, as on the right. And you see the picture there, that's from the White Sea to the Baltic Canal that was dug at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Or in a few cases, you might be internally, externally exiled. Now, the Gulag was by far the most common, as the secret police ran a whole economy based on it. So basically, the secret police ran what the equivalent in terms of, if you're comparing the Stalinist years to the capitalist mode of production, the equivalent of the slave trade. But on the other hand, and this has to be pointed out, that it wasn't all like this. If you were a technician, a scientist, or other useful professional, under Stalin, though not under Khrushchev, Khrushchev put an end to it. You think Khrushchev was the liberal guy who freed everybody up, but actually Khrushchev put a stop to it. Your fate might not be so cruel. So if you were deemed to be one of these people, Solzhenitsyn was one of them. In the Stalin era, there were specialized camps with relatively decent conditions for such people to earn their freedom, as the terminology went, on usually military projects. The famed rocket scientist Korolev on there is pictured on the left. Next slide. Right, we'll talk a bit about Stalin's foreign policy now. Soviet foreign policy under Stalin they started off with a brief flirtation with the idea of world revolution again. This was a rather crude misunderstanding of what was happening in the West in the early 1930s. He concluded from the 1929 crash, because the USSR had managed to isolate itself economically from that event. Not many people know this, by the way, but the USSR did not get any of the consequences from that because it was now independent of the gold standard, and was able to survive that without any economic difficulties. So he starts out with this idea that world revolution is imminent, and I'm going to lead it, and all the rest of it. And so he contacts all the communist parties in the world, and he says, you must now denounce all social democrats you'd normally be allied with. And in fact, Lenin had insisted that they ally with them. He said, you've now got to denounce them as counter-revolutionaries. This is really quite bizarre. And in the the consequences of this was to make communist parties in the West, it was to put them in a handicap from which they would never recover. The military forces extensively built up, so at least on paper, they're the equivalent of their capitalist neighbors. Next slide. I want to talk just a bit about the Spanish Revolution. The Spanish Revolution breaks out in 1936, and the CPSU takes a hostile approach to the centrality of anarchism in it. You see, there isn't really a communist party in Spain. Well, there is, but it's tiny, and they have virtually no involvement in the revolution when it happens. The revolution, officially it breaks out in February, but it gets a big kick in July and goes into full mode then when the Republic is attacked by the counter-revolutionary forces under Franco, and a coup is attempted. and civil war breaks out. So this revolution follows the direct workers' control pattern. Remember, we've been talking about Soviets with a small s, that meaning workers' councils, and the anarchists, and to a certain degree socialists, and also what we call council communists, that is communists who do not accept that the revolution has to be led by a party, but accept that it has to be led by the working class itself. The July Revolution follows this pattern, which was actually what originally happened in 1917 in Russia as well. However, by being the only power to arm and equip the Republic against the fascists, because the European powers were now pursuing a policy of appeasement, and through the manipulations of the Spanish Communist Party on orders from Moscow, the revolution gets crushed from within. From within, before Franco manages to win the civil war. So not only does Stalin's policy lose him the war in Spain, but it also the only thing it does manage to do is to crush the revolution in the country. So what was all that about? Soviet policy towards the rise of fascism in Europe was ambiguous and contradictory, as I've just exemplified. Having alienated social democrats in the early 1930s, by the mid-1930s, the policy switches round to forging popular fronts with Western democracies at the expense of all talk about revolution. Next slide. Right, realizing that the USSR was now the objective for Nazi colonization, or Lebensraum, and with the West pursuing a policy of appeasement, Stalin decides in his Machiavellian way to stall for time with a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. This catches the Western allies out by surprise. And it also allows Stalin to establish buffer zones in the through occupation of Eastern Poland. She invades more or less simultaneously with the Nazis coming in from the other end, and also the formerly independent Baltic states. And repression is implemented immediately as soon as they enter into these states, especially in Poland, where several massacres take place, the most famous of which, of course, is Katyn. However, despite everything, the Nazi invasion of the USSR catches Stalin by surprise in 1941. And it has to be beaten back only at the cost of an estimated 28 million lives. That's Soviet citizens and soldiers together, some 28 million. A lot of them who were captured dying in Nazi captivity as slave labor in Germany. The picture on the left shows the red flag being raised over the Brandenburg Gate in 1945. It's a famous picture, of course. By now, Soviet troops are occupying all of Eastern Europe, and over time, and with the onset of the Cold War, Soviet-aligned governments are installed in each of these, with the exceptions of Albania and Yugoslavia, which, despite being controlled by communist parties, they pursue a different line, and they refuse to obey orders from Moscow. Next picture. So we go back to the Soviet Union, and in Stalin's time, as I've been explaining, the followers he's chosen to suit his purpose, because Stalin was from a working class background actually, and he was mainly amongst people who were from the intelligentsia, people like Trotsky and Lenin, for example, Bukharin, Kamenev. They all were highly educated and very clever people, and Stalin was a bit at odds in this group, and they often derided him in his early years, and of course he built up lists of them, and when his time came, he wiped them out. But the people he had chosen to suit his purpose were typically of working class origin, and they were propelled through the ranks by Stalin's patronage, and these people were now at the top of the CPSU, where they would remain, in fact, because the key players like Khrushchev and Brezhnev, which are pictured opposite, right up until Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the only person who's to emerge, and he emerges right at the end, who didn't come from this generation. The generation who grew up as sort of yes men to Stalin, they pretty much rule the Soviet Union right up until the very end. The immediate aftermath of Stalin's death in 1953 is to create a relaxation in the repression and deprivations of his dictatorship. Some of them stop, so should I say, pretty much halfway through. So somebody might be sentenced to a firing squad, and they think they're about to be shot, and then the order comes in, no, stop this. It happens as fast as that. And initially, the reforms are instigated by the unlikely figure of Beria, who is the character with the glasses on the left with Stalin's daughter on his knee. He was up until Stalin's death, he was considered to be like the devil. You know, he was seen as being somebody you didn't want to be around, because you were so terrified of him purging and then having you tortured and then killed. But so Beria is quite unusual, because suddenly he becomes a raging liberal, and he brings in all these reforms, and he also brings in ideas which he has of a mixed economy, you know, something similar to what the New Deal was establishing in Western Europe at the same time. And but Khrushchev wants to get rid of Beria because he's afraid of him, and so he does. But Khrushchev, of course, does continue with some of the limited reforms. However, his autocratic tendencies, especially after Stalin, alienate the other Politburo members. So by the time you get to Brezhnev, the Soviet Union leadership is no longer a dictatorship. It's pretty much, it's now an oligarchy. It's a straightforward oligarchy, on the oligarchy of the Central Committee, and in particular the Politburo, again dominated by men who would be aging as time goes on. Next slide. Right, we'll talk just a wee bit about the Warsaw Pact. I think this is a useful topic. Right, the Warsaw Pact was formed together with Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe. In the 1950s, you can see it on the map on the left there. The Warsaw Pact was ostensibly built for the defense, or mutual defense against NATO in Western Europe. Most of the time in Western Europe, the narrative is to get the idea that the Warsaw Pact was formed first. This is not actually correct. The Warsaw Pact was formed second. In the NATO was actually established first in the 1940s. Now, the other myth which is built up is that the Warsaw Pact was some form of a Soviet empire. You have to ask the question, what is an empire, first of all, and does it match up? Well, an empire is usually a power that manages to exploit its satellites, and it also manages to dominate them very, very rigorously. What we do know is that there was considerable disunity within the so-called Warsaw Pact countries, and they all had rivalry with each other, and they all had at various points in their existence, they also went against what the Soviet Union wanted, and the Soviet Union just had to go along with it. So that doesn't sound like a political empire to me. And again, it's not an economic empire, because the USSR fails to economically exploit its satellites. In fact, it's virtually the opposite. It deliberately, through policy, it allows the satellite states, if we want to call them that, Poland, East Germany, Romania, and so on, it allows them to maintain a higher standard of living than exists in the USSR itself. And we know that because Soviet troops, when they were posted to the Eastern Europe countries, they were able to engage in the black market and to get goods from Eastern Europe back into the Soviet Union. So it doesn't really stick with this whole Western narrative, which you get all the way going back to Ronald Reagan, of the evil empire. It doesn't really pan out. And in fact, a lot of the countries are hardline in relation to, say, Czechoslovakia. We have the next slide for this, actually. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the Prague Spring in 1968, with a Soviet army tank and a barricade that's been built up by Czech protesters. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, or at least didn't realize until they were able to get hold of the documents from Moscow, is that Brezhnev, who was the leader at the time, he replaced Khrushchev, was very against the idea of Soviet troops going into Czechoslovakia. He was pretty much bullied, because he thought it would lead to a bad end, which of course it did. But he was pushed into it by people like Honecker in East Germany, and also other Eastern European countries who were who were objecting to the to the, or they were worried about what was happening in the Prague Spring, and they didn't want it happening in their own countries, and so they turned to big uncle USSR and said, you've got to sort this out for us, and so eventually Brezhnev was bullied pretty much into sending the tanks in. Next slide. Of course, the Warsaw Pact is full of contradictions, as we've just been talking about. I'll just briefly talk about this one. This is quite an interesting one because it's the other side to the Warsaw Pact, as it were. It's not all about repression of dissent. In the case on the right, it was to facilitate the settlement of tens of thousands of refugees from Greece in the 1950s. It's worthwhile to summarize this story briefly. In 1944, the Western powers and the Soviet Union had carved up Europe at Yalta into their respective zones of interest. The Greeks, who had largely self-liberated themselves from the Nazis with a socialist partisan army, they fell under the British zone, the British control zone. And the British, rather than work with the Greeks who had already liberated themselves, they insisted on reinstalling the monarch, which is very unpopular, and they also, and to do this, they re-employed the ex-Nazi collaborators who were still hanging around, and they rearmed them, and they equipped them to suppress the popular socialist party and the socialist mass movement in a bloody civil war from 1944 to 49. There were lots of refugees produced by this brutal conflict. It's known as a secret war because the West didn't report about it, which makes it similar to, the repression of information in the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union is not the only power that's doing this. The secret war, the refugees from the secret war within Europe and created by the British, carried on by the United States, it runs to hundreds of thousands of people. And they have fled to, because there's nowhere else to flee because they're going to be massacred if they don't, they flee to Yugoslavia and Albania. But Yugoslavia and Albania can't cope with it. And it's the Warsaw Pact that agrees to resettle these people. And with every member state taking a quota, Poland was particularly generous. There were several other ones as well. USSR took some as well. And I remember seeing a video. The video is called The Secret War, actually. I think it's available on YouTube. And these are the children, which you can see in the picture, that lot going to Hungary, apparently. And you see these children who grow up into adults. In the 1980s, they go back to Greece, and they're full of praise for their treatment within the Warsaw Pact. Basically, they say that they came from illiterate peasant families for the most part, and they grew up well educated. They were given land of their own to farm, and they were also able to learn important work skills when they went back to Greece. in the 1980s, because Greece is not exactly an economy that is particularly vibrant, and yet these work skills that they had learned were able to get them jobs once they went back. Okay, next slide. Right, some other problems beset the standard Western narrative of the USSR as an all-powerful aggressive state. Firstly, the facts don't bear up to the reality, and we can now analyze all the documents, and we can reveal that at best they are heavily exaggerated. At all stages in the Cold War, the Soviet Union fell well behind the United States in the so-called balance of terror. This is in terms of ICBM, meaning intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear armed. They fell way behind the United States in numbers and capability. You can see one of the missiles that the Soviets had on parade in Red Square, but actually it's probably a dud, or it's a very old missile which has been trundled out again to go on the Red Square parade. And of course, Western intelligence knew this, but the propaganda being spread was, oh, the Russians have built a new missile and it's even bigger than the last one, etc., etc. So, and also in terms of conventional forces, the USSR and conventional forces equipment, especially, they were very clearly outmatched. And this can be proved by looking at any stand-up conflict that came out of the proxy wars that occurred during the Cold War and after, in fact, in Asia and Africa. You can see that directly because in a stand-up symmetric war, then the Soviet equipment and technology has no chance against that of the West. It has to be said, however, that in terms of asymmetrical warfare, the Soviet equipment was actually probably better, because the Soviet weaponry, especially the famous AK-47 assault rifle, was much more practical for use by guerrilla forces than, say, the US M16, its equivalent. On a more cynical level, we have to look at the arms race as serving a purpose for the Western powers beyond the threat narrative, which was intended only for domestic consumption. Everybody who grew up in the West remembers this in the 1970s, 1980s, and probably 1960s as well, that the USSR was poised to launch all its missiles and invade everybody and all the rest of it. So that was the threat narrative, but it also, on a practical level, it allowed them to ruin the USSR in an absurd race that it couldn't win. And this was a race embraced by the Brezhnev era. Brezhnev was determined to turn the Soviet Union into a superpower, to distract everybody's attention from the economy collapsing, which he did actually, up to some extent, achieve. But the cost was destroying or damaging the economy beyond repair, and forcing the government to deny a decent standard of living to its citizens. Next slide. Okay, so this is to finish off, we're going to deal with the daily life in the USSR. This is just a series of pictures and to show what people would have, how people would have lived, ordinary people, ordinary working class people mainly, how they would have lived. So next slide. Right, so we have some miners there, getting ready to go down the pit. They obviously haven't gone down yet. And on the right, you can see payday at the factory, and everybody's looking quite anxious. Are they going to be paid enough? And are they going to be paid what they are due? You can see the expressions on everybody's faces. So it's very much like what would have been, this was probably in 1970s, what would have been the exact same situation in Western capitalist factory. Next picture. Right, Lenin, as we said, his wishes for a very discreet burial were not allowed, and he was turned into this sort of god-like figure who was central to the whole revolution or the post-revolutionary ideology. So he becomes a sort of idol, and he is set up in, there's a Lenin prospect set up in every town across the USSR, and one of the same limited range of uniform statues in every town is set up. This totem becomes the center for regular public ceremonies where attendance is expected. And then on the right here, you have the pioneers. The pioneers were originally conceived as an elite institution for adolescent party cadres. But by the 1950s, the pioneers have become a near universally attended equivalent of the Boy Scouts or Girl Guides in Western countries. And post Second World War, there were lots of activities organized for them to do, and and many of them were, I suppose, were good fun. Because I know from speaking to several ex-Soviet citizens that they look back in these days of their youth when they were pioneer in a nostalgic, sentimental, halcyon glow. Next slide. Right, we're going to talk a bit about despite the reforms that we've been talking about, many aspects of the CPSU's Stalin era continue on to the bitter end. The basic way the society is organized continues from the start of the Stalin era at the end of the 1920s, right up until the end of the USSR. The first of all is this drive to create model citizens, invariably male industrial workers, and they are to serve as an idealized example to the rest of the workforce, which, as we've already explained, is mainly engaged in slacking off and or sabotage, because they're engaged in class war. Who they're engaged in class war against, we can discuss in the final part of this program. The USSR from Stalin onwards runs a full employment policy, as we've already explained. So work is created by central planners for everybody, regardless of whether it's necessary or not. The picture at the top shows Stakhanov. So this is this worship of work. And the Stakhanov has been revealed as being basically, he's less of a worker, more of an actor. He was supposed to act out his role, and others elevated and lauded for this in a manner similar manner for propaganda. They were known as Stakhanovists. Later on, the name changes to Peredovic. You can see the guy with his in the bottom picture. He's got jeans on. Well, where's he got those jeans from? Probably from the black market. But he's still a model worker. Okay, next slide. Right, so communal living is illustrated here. In most cases, citizens lived in communal apartment blocks, where each family usually only had a single room, and the residents shared all the other, the residents of the block shared all the other facilities. Most private residences of any size in the town had been seized during the revolution, and they were divided up due to a housing shortage at the time. But later constructions followed the same pattern. So this way of life is to continue right to the end, and in many cases beyond. Next picture. Right, the dacha, however, is this what gives you some relief from the confines of urban communal living. Originally, it's a country residence for the gentry in Tsarist times. From the later 1950s onwards, the meaning was changed to apply to increasingly available plots in the country where you could go for a holiday. So a lot of people, when they'd finished work for the week, they would head off to the dacha if it was close enough. Otherwise, if it wasn't that close, then you might have to only go there on the holidays. Possession of a dacha initially depended on your connections and on the perceived social worth of your job. But by the 1970s, the facility had become available to the general public. We have to realize that from the late 1950s to roughly about the 1980s, life is as good as it will get in the Soviet Union. There is a general feeling within the Soviet Union that life is improving, maybe not as fast as people would like, but it is definitely improving. A dacha is a small plot for growing vegetables originally, but it had enough space on it to build a house. And if your house is big enough, then you could, the whole family could expand into several private rooms, and the usual proximity of other dachas in the neighborhood. They meant that you had people to talk to invite round for a meal or some drinks, and your children could go out into the woods and into the fields to play games and come back home very dirty, as children love to do. As well as recreational privacy, of course, the dacha provides also an opportunity to talk on otherwise forbidden topics. Next slide. As a Soviet citizen, you expected to join in with your community members one day a week. This was namely Saturday, cleaning up the neighborhood. It was all perceived as a morale boosting way to get people to cooperate on some socially useful task. In the picture there seemed to be digging a ditch. There was no penalty as such for not taking part. There was no legal penalty, but non-compliant community members would be looked down upon. They might be pressurized, ostracized, and or gossiped about. Community cleaning, of course, and this is another aspect that we should be looking at. It, of course, serves to save the state money. As far as the state's concerned, that's its main function. The next slide. There are also quite big facilities built to serve the public in the post-Stalin period, or even during the Stalin period. We have to realize this swimming pool here was originally built in the 1930s. It in fact features in the Master and Margarita, written by Bulgakov. So these facilities were built on a grandiose scale, but they were built to serve the public. The subways, and the Moscow subway is another example that goes back to the Stalin period. So this heated outdoor swimming pool was built in the center of Moscow on the site of an Orthodox cathedral that they took down. I think it's St. Anne's or something, can't remember. From the 1930s on to the 1980s, the swimming pool, which could be used in the summer and winter alike, because in the winter you just heated the water up. I've seen some pictures, and people are using the pool. They are just in their swimming costumes, and steam is rising from the water, and everywhere else around is about a foot of snow. So quite an accomplishment, really, and it was well used. The Muscovites we used it very regularly, and also school outings and day trippers came in from the provinces to enjoy its facility. Of course, in the 1990s, the state ran out of money, and so it was sold back to the church, and the church promptly knocked it all down, and they built another bloody cathedral. Okay, next picture. Right, chess is another pastime that was very popular in the Soviet Union. It involved mass participation. The fascination with chess probably starts in the 1920s, or at least that's as early as the pictures I've managed to get hold of. People would gather in parks, squares, and other public places to play chess for fun and or to join in tournaments. And as we know, the Soviet Union provided the world with some phenomenal chess players, especially during the 1960s and 70s. Next slide. So we reach our final picture here now, and a slightly ironic question here at the bottom. And what chronology of working class life in former USSR would be complete without a picture of a queue or of the black market? Black market for high prestige Western commodities, of course, courtesy of Eastern Europe, where they've come in from, and being probably brought in by or Soviet soldiers on service in Eastern Europe on their leave. So we have a picture of a queue. There was a terrible problem with commodities, the basic commodities. Queues were generic in the Soviet Union. Ironically, today in the West with COVID, the queues are perhaps they're becoming as common in the West now as they were in the former USSR. Who knows? And then of course in the picture at the bottom you can see a young guy, and he's a school child probably. He's selling on some foreign cigarettes, which probably for a great huge extended price. Okay, I've finished part 2 now, and part 3, when we come back, will be on the arts, the sciences, and on the and sports.